My husband's funeral turned into a circus when my daughter-in-law claimed she was pregnant with him. The whole family was in shock. My son cried. I smiled, because I knew she just wanted the inheritance. At the will reading, my lawyer said, "This is the deceased's letter, along with a DNA test and a video." The truth made her go pale. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Bessie, and at 64 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened at Harold's funeral. The morning started like any widow's worst nightmare should, with that hollow feeling in your chest and the impossible task of saying goodbye to the man you'd loved for 38 years. Harold had been my rock, my partner in everything. When the heart attack took him 3 days earlier, I felt like half of myself had been ripped away. The funeral home was packed. Harold had been well loved in our community. A retired teacher who'd touched countless lives, a volunteer at the local food bank, the kind of man who'd shovel your driveway without being asked. People filled every pew and spilled into the aisles, sharing stories and memories that should have brought me comfort. But my eyes kept drifting to the front row, where my son Darren sat with his wife Bellamy. Even in my grief, something about her behavior felt off. She kept checking her phone, adjusting her black dress, and shooting glances at me when she thought I wasn't looking. After 5 years of marriage to my son, I'd learned to read Bellamy's moods, and today she seemed almost excited. That should have been my first warning. The service proceeded beautifully. Harold's former students spoke about how he'd changed their lives. His fishing buddy shared stories that made people laugh through their tears. When it came time for family remarks, Darren stood up, his voice breaking as he talked about what an amazing father Harold had been. I was so proud of my son in that moment. At 35, Darren had grown into a good man, despite some rough patches in his 20s. He'd found steady work as an electrician, bought a nice house, and seemed happy with Bellamy. Watching him honor his stepfather, because Harold wasn't his biological father, but had raised him since he was 7, filled my heart even as it broke. Then Bellamy stood up. "I have something to share," she announced, her voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere like a knife. "Something beautiful that will help us all remember Harold." I felt my stomach drop. Bellamy wasn't scheduled to speak. This wasn't planned. She placed her hand dramatically on her stomach, her eyes glistening with what looked like tears, but felt like performance. Harold and I, we shared something special, something that will keep his memory alive forever. The room went dead silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. "I'm pregnant," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the funeral home. "With Harold's baby." The gasp that went through the crowd sounded like a collective punch to the gut. I heard someone's prayer book hit the floor. Mrs. Henderson from down the street actually said, "Oh my Lord," out loud. But it was Darren's reaction that broke my heart. My strong, capable son crumpled like a house of cards. His face went white, then red, then white again. Tears started streaming down his cheeks as he stared at his wife in complete shock. "What?" he whispered. But in the silence, everyone heard it. Bellamy reached for his hand. "I found out yesterday. I was going to wait, but I thought people should know that there's still a part of Harold with us." The funeral director looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. People were whispering, some getting up and leaving, others craning their necks to get a better look at the drama unfolding in the front row. "And me?" I smiled. Not a big smile. I'm not heartless. My husband had just died, and my son was falling apart in front of a room full of people, but there was a small, knowing smile that I couldn't quite suppress because I knew something that Bellamy didn't think I knew. I knew exactly who Bellamy was. For 5 years, I'd watched this woman manipulate my son, charm my husband, and work her way into our family like a virus. She was beautiful, I'll give her that, tall and blonde with the kind of figure that made men stupid, but beneath that pretty exterior was a calculating mind that saw dollar signs where others saw relationships. She'd married Darren right when Harold's construction business was doing well, before the economy forced him to retire early. She'd been all sweetness and light during the courtship, cooking Harold's favorite meals, asking about his work, acting like the perfect daughter-in-law. but I'd seen the real Bellamy in unguarded moments. The way she'd count the cash in Harold's wallet when she thought no one was looking. How she'd steer conversations toward money and inheritance whenever Harold's health came up. The times I'd caught her going through our mail, looking at bank statements and insurance papers. Harold had been successful, yes. We owned our house outright, had decent savings, and his life insurance policy was substantial. For someone like Bellamy, that represented opportunity. The pregnancy announcement was brilliant, really. If people believed it, she'd have a claim to Harold's estate that could supersede even my rights as his widow. A posthumous child would be entitled to a significant portion of the inheritance, and as the mother, Bellamy would control that money for at least 18 years. Too bad for her that Harold had figured out her game months ago. As the funeral home erupted in confused whispers and Darren sobbed into his hands, I reached over and placed my hand on my son's shoulder. "It's going to be okay, honey," I whispered. "I promise you, everything is going to be okay." Bellamy shot me a look that was pure triumph mixed with fake sympathy. She thought she'd won. She thought this dramatic announcement had secured her future and destroyed any chance of the family questioning her motives. She had no idea that Harold and I had been expecting this exact move for months. We'd prepared for it, planned for it, and now we were ready to respond to it. The funeral ended in chaos, with people streaming out in shocked whispers and poor Darren barely able to stand. As we walked to the burial site, Bellamy kept her hand on her stomach, playing the part of the grieving pregnant woman to perfection. But I caught her checking her phone again, and this time I saw what was on the screen, a text to someone named Marcus that read, "Phase 1 complete. Meeting tomorrow to discuss next steps. Phase 1. Like this was some kind of business plan, which I suppose it was. The 3 days following Harold's funeral were a masterclass in manipulation, and Bellamy was the star pupil. She'd moved into our house temporarily, ostensibly to help me through my grief and to be closer to Harold's memory during her pregnancy. In reality, I knew she was positioning herself to establish residency and strengthen her claim to the estate. I watched her work with the kind of sick fascination you might have watching a snake swallow a mouse. Every gesture was calculated, every tear perfectly timed. "Oh, Bessie," she'd sigh, placing her hand on that flat stomach of hers. "I keep thinking about how Harold will never get to meet his baby. It just breaks my heart." She'd say this while rifling through Harold's desk drawers, of course, looking for insurance papers, will documents, anything that might give her insight into exactly how much money was at stake. The performance was Oscar-worthy. She'd taken to wearing loose-fitting clothes and making a show of being nauseous in the mornings. She'd hold her back like it ached and sigh dramatically whenever she thought someone was watching. But I'd raised 2 children and buried one. I knew what real pregnancy looked like, and this wasn't it. The money requests started immediately. "I need to see a specialist," she told Darren on the second day. "For the baby. High-risk pregnancy, given the circumstances." She managed to squeeze out a tear. "It's going to be expensive, but Harold would want me to have the best care." My poor son, still reeling from the double shock of losing his stepfather and finding out his wife was supposedly carrying his child's half-sibling, just nodded numbly. "Whatever you need, Belle. Harold would definitely want that." $500 for the specialist appointment that, I noticed, she somehow managed to schedule for the exact same time that Darren would be at work and unable to accompany her. Then came the nutritional supplements. "The doctor says the baby needs special vitamins. Pregnancy after 40 is complicated, especially when there's been trauma." Another $300. The maternity clothes came next. "I'm showing earlier than expected. The doctor says it might be twins." $700 at the boutique downtown, where she made sure to run into at least 6 people who knew our family. Within a week, she'd extracted over $1,500 from my son for a pregnancy that existed only in her imagination. But the money was just the beginning. Bellamy was building a narrative, and she needed witnesses. She started inviting Harold's friends over for coffee, playing the grieving widow who was bravely carrying on for the sake of the unborn child. She'd serve them cake and cry prettily about how Harold had been so excited when she told him about the baby. He was like a little kid, she'd tell them, dabbing her eyes with tissues. He immediately started talking about converting the spare room into a nursery. Said he couldn't wait to teach another child how to fish. Harold hated fishing. He was allergic to most fish and hadn't held a fishing rod in 20 years. But Bellamy's audience didn't know that. She was particularly effective with Harold's elderly friends, the ones who remembered him as a young teacher full of energy and dreams. They ate up her stories about how vital and happy he'd been in his final months when he learned he was going to be a father again. Mrs. Chen from the church auxiliary brought over baby blankets she'd knitted. Mr. Rodriguez offered to help set up the nursery. The whole community was rallying around Harold's pregnant widow, and Bellamy basked in the attention like a cat in sunshine. Meanwhile, Darren was falling apart. My son had always been sensitive, but this situation was destroying him. He'd lost the only father figure he'd ever really known, and now he was grappling with the idea that his wife had been intimate with that same man. "I don't understand how this happened, Mom," he confided in me one evening when Bellamy was out at another doctor's appointment. "I mean, I know how it happened, but when? How long were they?" I wanted to tell him the truth so badly, that it hadn't happened at all, that his wife was a liar and a manipulator who was using his grief against him. But Harold had made me promise to wait, to let things play out according to our plan. "Sometimes people we love disappoint us," I said instead, hating every word. "But that doesn't mean we stop loving them." Darren nodded miserably. Harold was such a good man. If he and Bellamy had feelings for each other, I mean, it hurts, but maybe I should try to understand. That's when I knew Bellamy had won this round. She'd successfully rewritten the narrative to make Harold the unfaithful husband and herself the innocent victim of passion. Even worse, she'd managed to make Darren feel guilty for being hurt by their supposed affair. But Bellamy made one crucial mistake in those early days. She got greedy. It started with the house comments. "You know, Bessie, this place is awfully big for just one person, and with the baby coming, I'm going to need more space." Then the inheritance hints. Harold always said he wanted to take care of his children. All of his children. "I hope when everything gets settled, you'll remember that this baby is his child too." Finally, the direct approach. "I think we should meet with Harold's lawyer soon, just to make sure everything is properly arranged for the baby's future." She wanted to force the will reading. She wanted to establish her claim before I had time to contest it. She was pushing for a quick resolution, probably hoping to get her hands on whatever Harold had left before anyone could ask too many questions. That's when I knew it was time. "You're absolutely right," I told her that Friday morning, watching her face light up with triumph. "Harold would want us to take care of his child. I'll call Mr. Patterson today and set up a meeting for next week." "Really?" She tried to contain her excitement but failed miserably. "I think that's very wise, Bessie. Harold always said you were a practical woman." "Oh, I am," I assured her. "Very practical." In fact, Harold left some very specific instructions about how he wanted things handled. "I think you'll find his arrangements quite illuminating." Something flickered in her eyes then. Uncertainty, maybe even fear, but she'd come too far to back down now. "I'm sure whatever Harold decided will be fair," she said carefully. I smiled at her, the same small smile I'd worn at the funeral. "I'm counting on it." As I reached for the phone to call Harold's attorney, I caught Bellamy watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw the calculating predator underneath. But then she caught herself and pasted on that sweet, innocent smile. "I'll just go rest for a bit. All this emotion isn't good for the baby." Right. The baby that didn't exist, that she was carrying for the man who'd figured out her game 3 months before he died. Harold had always been 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Death hadn't changed that. Mr. Patterson's law office felt like a courtroom that Tuesday morning, though none of us were prepared for the trial that was about to unfold. Bellamy had dressed carefully for the occasion, a flowing black dress that she kept smoothing over her stomach, sensible flats, minimal makeup to emphasize her supposed fragile condition. She'd even brought a small bottle of water and crackers, making sure everyone noticed her morning sickness preparations. Darren sat beside her, still looking like a man who'd been hit by a truck. He held her hand supportively, though I noticed he couldn't quite meet her eyes. The betrayal was still too fresh, too painful. I took my seat across from them, wearing Harold's favorite blue dress. He'd always said it brought out my eyes, and somehow wearing it made me feel like he was there with me. Mr. Patterson was a man in his 70s who'd handled Harold's legal affairs for over 20 years. He'd drawn up our wills, helped us with the business paperwork, and guided us through every major financial decision we'd made as a couple. If anyone knew Harold's mind, it was Thomas Patterson. "Before we begin, Mr. Patterson said, adjusting his glasses and opening a thick manila folder, "I want everyone to understand that Harold was very specific about how this meeting should be conducted. He left detailed instructions, and I intend to follow them exactly." Bellamy shifted in her chair, placing her hand protectively over her stomach. "Of course. Harold was always so thoughtful about everything." The lawyer nodded gravely. Indeed he was, particularly in his final months, when he spent considerable time updating his estate plans and making certain preparations. He pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age but clearly recent. "Harold asked me to read this letter first, before we discuss any financial arrangements." My heart started racing. This was it, the moment Harold had planned for, the moment we'd discussed in whispered conversations during his final weeks. Mr. Patterson broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "This is dated 3 months before Harold's death, and it's in his handwriting, which I can verify as I've seen it countless times over the years." Bellamy leaned forward slightly, her face showing just the right amount of respectful attention. "To my beloved family," Mr. Patterson began reading. "If you are hearing this letter, then I am gone, and certain events have unfolded exactly as I predicted they would." I watched Bellamy's face carefully, still calm, still playing her part. "First, let me say how much I love each of you. Bessie, my darling wife, you have been my rock for 38 years. Darren, my son in every way that matters, you have grown into the man I always hoped you would become." Darren wiped his eyes, overcome with emotion. Bellamy squeezed his hand sympathetically. "However," Mr. Patterson continued, and his voice took on a more serious tone, "I must address some difficult truths that have come to my attention in recent months. Truths about deception, manipulation, and greed within our family circle." Now Bellamy's composure flickered, just for a second. "I have discovered that someone very close to us has been planning to exploit my death for financial gain. This person has been carefully positioning themselves to make claims on my estate through lies and manipulation." The room went deadly quiet. Darren looked confused, glancing between me and Bellamy. Bellamy's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "Specifically," the lawyer read on, "I have reason to believe that after my death, claims will be made about a pregnancy, claims that are entirely false and designed solely to access inheritance money." Bellamy went white, actually white. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. "What?" Darren whispered, looking at his wife in growing horror. Mr. Patterson wasn't finished. He reached into his folder and pulled out a small manila envelope. "Harold also left this with very specific instructions about when to open it." He broke the seal and removed a single sheet of paper. "This is a DNA test result, conducted by GeneTech Labs 3 weeks before Harold's death." Bellamy tried to speak, but no sound came out. The test was performed on a hair sample from Bellamy Parker, obtained from a hairbrush in the guest bathroom of Harold and Bessie's home. Mr. Patterson looked directly at Bellamy as he continued. "The results definitively prove that Harold Jennings is not and cannot be the father of any child Bellamy Parker might be carrying." The silence that followed was deafening. Darren's hand dropped away from Bellamy's like she'd suddenly caught fire. "What the hell is going on?" Bellamy found her voice then, but it was shaky, defensive. "This is ridiculous. Harold, we never. I mean, the baby isn't his, obviously. I never said it was his." "Actually," Mr. Patterson said calmly, "you announced at his funeral that you were pregnant with Harold's child. We have 17 witnesses who heard you make that exact claim. I was emotional, grieving. People misunderstood what I meant. But Darren was staring at her with growing realization. Belle, you've been taking money from me for doctor's appointments, for vitamins, for maternity clothes. You said the baby was Harold's. I never explicitly said. You placed your hand on your stomach and said you were pregnant with Harold's baby. Darren's voice was rising. In front of 300 people. Bellamy's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Okay, fine. Maybe I let people believe something that wasn't true. But I am pregnant, Darren, just not with Harold's baby. The lawyer cleared his throat. I'm afraid that's not accurate either, Mrs. Parker. He reached into the folder again and pulled out another document. Harold also arranged for a private investigator to document your activities over the past 2 months. This report includes photographs of you leaving the Planned Parenthood clinic downtown, drinking alcohol at Murphy's Bar, and smoking cigarettes behind the Walmart on 5th Street. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Darren was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. More specifically, Mr. Patterson continued relentlessly. The investigator followed you to Dr. Martinez's office last Tuesday. The same appointment you told your husband was with a pregnancy specialist. The report indicates you were actually there for a routine physical, during which you specifically requested birth control pills. Bellamy shot to her feet, her hand still clutched to her stomach in a gesture that now looked pathetic rather than protective. This is harassment. You can't spy on people like that. Actually, the lawyer said mildly, when fraud is suspected in relation to inheritance claims, such investigations are entirely legal and appropriate. Darren stood up too, but he was moving away from his wife, not toward her. You're not pregnant at all, are you? For a long moment, Bellamy said nothing. Then, perhaps realizing that the evidence against her was overwhelming, she dropped her hand from her stomach and straightened her shoulders. Fine, no, I'm not pregnant, but you don't understand the whole situation. There are things about Harold that you don't know. Things about why I had to what? I spoke for the first time since the meeting began, my voice calm but steel hard. Had to lie? Had to manipulate my son? Had to try to steal from a dead man? She whirled to face me, and for the first time I saw the real Bellamy. Not the sweet, grieving woman she'd been playing, but someone desperate and cornered and dangerous. You think you're so perfect, don't you, Bessie? You think Harold was such a saint? Well, maybe you should ask your precious husband about the money he's been giving me for the past year. Ask him about the promises he made. Darren looked like he'd been slapped. What money? What promises? But Mr. Patterson was already reaching for another envelope, this one thicker than the others. Actually, Harold anticipated this line of argument as well. Bellamy, I think you'll find his final revelation quite educational. As he began to open the envelope, Bellamy backed toward the door. Her mask had completely fallen away now, replaced by something wild and calculating. I don't have to listen to this, she said. Whatever Harold thought he knew, whatever lies he told you, the only lies, I said quietly, are the ones you've been telling. But don't worry, dear. Harold documented everything. Every conversation, every manipulation, every lie you told. We've been waiting for this moment for months. She stared at me with pure hatred, all pretense finally gone. And that's when Mr. Patterson pulled out the video camera. The video camera was small, modern, the kind you might use to record family gatherings or school plays. But as Mr. Patterson set it up on his desk and pressed play, I knew we were about to witness something far more significant than holiday memories. Harold's face filled the screen, and despite everything, my heart clenched seeing him again. He looked tired. This had been recorded during his final weeks, but his eyes were sharp, determined. If you're watching this, Harold's recorded voice filled the quiet office, then Bellamy has made her move, and it's time for the truth. Bellamy had frozen in the doorway, her hand on the handle, clearly torn between fleeing and staying to see what other secrets were about to be revealed. Darren sank back into his chair, his face pale. Dad? He whispered, though of course Harold couldn't hear him. On screen, Harold leaned forward slightly, his expression grave. Darren, son, I need you to understand something. The woman you married is not who you think she is, and I'm about to prove it. The camera angle shifted, and I realized this had been recorded in Harold's study at home, the room where he'd spent so many evenings reading and planning for our retirement. 3 months ago, Harold continued, Bellamy approached me with what she called a business proposition. But she had discovered some information about my financial assets, information she shouldn't have had access to, and she wanted to discuss how we might work together to ensure her future security. Bellamy finally stepped back into the room, closing the door behind her. Her face was a mask of fury and fear. She told me, Harold's voice continued, that she knew about the life insurance policies, the retirement accounts, and the real estate investments. She had done her research very thoroughly. She also told me that she was concerned about what might happen to her if something were to happen to me, since I was, as she put it, getting up there in years. Darren made a choking sound. She said that to you? On screen, Harold nodded as if he could hear the question. She suggested that it might be wise for me to update my will to include provisions for her, just in case. When I asked why she felt entitled to my estate, she said something very interesting. The video paused momentarily, and Mr. Patterson looked directly at Bellamy. Would you like to guess what she said, or shall we let Harold tell us? Bellamy's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. She said nothing. Harold's voice resumed. She told me that she could be very creative in establishing her right to inherit. She specifically mentioned that posthumous children have strong legal claims to their father's estates, and that DNA evidence can be problematic when the alleged father is no longer alive to provide fresh samples. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. She was telling me, Harold continued, his voice gaining strength, that she was prepared to claim she was pregnant with my child after my death, and that proving otherwise would be difficult and expensive for my family. Darren shot to his feet, spinning to face his wife. You planned this? Before he even died, you were planning to claim you were pregnant with his baby? Bellamy finally found her voice, but it was sharp and defensive. You don't understand. Harold was old, sick. I needed security. I needed to know I'd be taken care of. By lying? By stealing? Darren's voice cracked with emotion, but Harold wasn't finished. The video continued, and his expression grew harder. When Bellamy made her proposition, I realized I was dealing with someone far more dangerous than I had initially thought, so I decided to play along. I told her I was impressed by her forward thinking, and that I would consider her suggestions. A chill ran down my spine. Even knowing how this would end, watching Harold deliberately walk into Bellamy's trap was terrifying. Over the next several weeks, Harold continued, I allowed Bellamy to believe that I was becoming increasingly dependent on her company and advice. I let her think that she was manipulating me into changing my will in her favor. The camera angle shifted again, and I could see some papers on Harold's desk. Legal documents, bank statements. What Bellamy didn't know, Harold said, and I could hear a hint of satisfaction in his voice, was that I was recording every conversation we had, every suggestion she made about my estate, every threat, veiled or otherwise. Mr. Patterson reached over and fast-forwarded the video. Harold recorded over 6 hours of conversations with Bellamy. We don't have time to watch them all, but here are some highlights. The screen changed, showing a different angle of Harold's study. This time, Bellamy was in the frame too, sitting across from Harold's desk. The date stamp showed this was just 5 weeks before Harold's death. Harold, sweetheart. Bellamy's recorded voice was sickeningly sweet. I've been thinking about what we discussed, about making sure I'm provided for. Of course, dear, Harold replied, his voice warm, but his eyes, I noticed, completely cold. I think it would be smart to set aside a significant amount for any children you might have in the future. You never know what life might bring. Children? Bellamy, I'm 72 years old. She laughed, a sound like tinkling bells that made my skin crawl. Stranger things have happened. And if something were to happen to you, well, it would be important that any of your children were taken care of. All of your children. Are you suggesting that you and I might? I'm just saying that if we did, and if I became pregnant, that child would deserve the same inheritance rights as any other child of yours. Harold paused, then said carefully, "And if you were to claim such a pregnancy after my death? Well," Bellamy's smile was predatory, "it would be very difficult to disprove, wouldn't it? DNA tests require samples from both parents, and if one parent is unavailable, the tests become much more complicated." Mr. Patterson stopped the video. This conversation took place 6 weeks before Harold's death. She was already planning her fraud. Darren was staring at the screen in horror. She was planning to fake being pregnant with Dad's baby while he was still alive, while she was married to me. "Actually," Mr. Patterson said, reaching for another folder, "that's not the worst part." He pulled out a thick stack of photographs. The private investigator Harold hired also discovered that Bellamy has been having an affair for the past 8 months with a man named Marcus Reed, who happens to be a paralegal at a competing law firm. The photos showed Bellamy entering and leaving a motel, always with the same tall, dark-haired man. In some of the pictures, they were kissing. In others, they appeared to be exchanging documents. Marcus Reed, Mr. Patterson continued, specializes in inheritance law and estate fraud. He's currently under investigation by the state bar for helping clients make fraudulent claims against deceased persons' estates. Bellamy had gone completely white. "Those photos are fake. You can't—" "The timestamps are verified by the motel's security cameras," the lawyer interrupted. "We also have phone records showing over 300 calls between you and Mr. Reed in the past 6 months. Darren was looking at the photos with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse. 8 months? You've been cheating on me for 8 months? It's not what you think." "What I think," Darren said quietly, "is that you married me to get close to Harold's money. You've been planning this fraud for months, working with some lawyer to figure out how to steal from my family. And you've been cheating on me the entire time." Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. Harold's final video message." He restarted the recording, and Harold's face appeared again. This time, he was looking directly into the camera, speaking with the authority of a man who had already won a battle his enemy didn't even know they were fighting. "Bellamy," Harold said, and his voice was ice cold. "If you're watching this, then you've already made your false pregnancy announcement. You've probably taken money from my son for fake medical expenses. You've definitely tried to establish your claim to my estate through lies and manipulation." On the screen, Harold leaned back in his chair, and for the first time in the recording, he smiled. "But you made one crucial mistake. You assumed I was just a foolish old man who could be easily deceived. You assumed that I wouldn't fight back." The smile faded, replaced by something harder and more determined. "I have documented every lie you've told, every manipulation you've attempted, and every crime you've committed. The evidence has been turned over to the district attorney's office, and by the time you watch this video, a warrant has likely been issued for your arrest on charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy." Bellamy backed against the door, her hand fumbling for the handle. "But most importantly," Harold continued, "I want you to know that you have failed, completely and utterly failed. My estate will go exactly where I always intended it to go. To my beloved wife Bessie and my son Darren, you will receive nothing. Nothing except the consequences of your own greed and cruelty." The video ended, leaving the office in complete silence. Then Bellamy ran. Bellamy didn't get far. The click of her heels on the marble floor of Mr. Patterson's office building was cut short by the sound of the elevator doors opening. 2 police officers stepped out just as she reached the lobby, and I watched through the office window as her face went from desperate hope to crushing defeat in the span of 3 seconds. "Mrs. Bellamy Parker?" The taller officer's voice carried up to where we stood watching from the 7th floor. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted extortion." Even from that distance, I could see her shoulders sag. The game was over, and she knew it. Darren stood beside me at the window, his face a mixture of relief and devastation. "I can't believe she's really gone," he whispered. "I can't believe any of this was real, Mr. Patterson was organizing Harold's documents, preparing to file the official paperwork that would finalize the estate proceedings. Your father was very thorough, he told us. The evidence against Bellamy is overwhelming. The district attorney expects this to be a straightforward case. But I was watching my son, seeing the way his hands shook as he tried to process everything that had happened. Losing Harold had been devastating enough. Discovering that his wife was a calculating predator who had been using him from day one might destroy him completely. Darren, I said gently, why don't we go home? We can finish the legal details later. He nodded numbly, still staring out the window, even though the police car had already driven away. I don't understand how I didn't see it, how I didn't know. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than the grief-stricken quiet that had filled our house since Harold's death. This was the silence of shock, of a world being turned completely upside down. When we got back to the house, Darren sat heavily on the couch in the living room, the same couch where Bellamy had performed her grief so convincingly just days before. She was never pregnant, he said, staring at his hands. She was never in love with Harold. She was never even faithful to me. I sat beside him, the way I had when he was a little boy dealing with scraped knees and hurt feelings. No, honey, she wasn't. The money I gave her for the doctor visits probably went to her boyfriend Marcus, or to pay for whatever she needed to make her lies more convincing. Darren's laugh was bitter and broken. $1,500 for a fake pregnancy. God, Mom, how stupid am I? You're not stupid, I said firmly. You're trusting. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now it feels like the same thing. I was quiet for a moment, thinking about Harold and the conversations we'd had during his final weeks. My husband had been furious about what Bellamy was doing to our son, but he'd also been determined to handle it in a way that would cause Darren the least possible pain. Your stepfather saw what was happening months before he died, I told Darren. He could have exposed her then, could have thrown her out and told you everything. But he didn't. Why not? Because he knew it would hurt you. He knew you'd blame yourself just like you're doing now. So he waited and he planned, and he made sure that when the truth came out, you'd have no choice but to see her for what she really was. Darren wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He protected me even after he was gone. That's what fathers do. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows of the house that Bellamy had coveted so desperately. I thought about all the time she'd wandered through these rooms, calculating their value, imagining herself as their owner. What happens now? Darren asked eventually. Now you heal. You rebuild. You remember that not everyone is like Bellamy. I mean legally, with the house, the money, all of that. I smiled, thinking of Harold's careful planning. Everything goes exactly where it was always supposed to go. Harold's will was ironclad. He left the house to me, along with the majority of his assets. But there's a substantial inheritance for you too. Enough to start over completely if you want to. Darren looked surprised. With everything that happened, Harold legally adopted you when you were 8 years old. In his eyes, and in the eyes of the law, you are his son, his only legitimate child. Bellamy's lies couldn't change that. How much? He asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. Sorry, that sounds greedy. It doesn't sound greedy. It sounds practical. I reached for the folder Mr. Patterson had given me. $250,000 plus half ownership of the cabin up at the lake. Darren's eyes widened. That much? Harold wanted to make sure you'd be financially independent, that you'd never have to depend on someone like Bellamy again. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you'll use it wisely. I will, I promise. As the evening wore on, I found myself thinking about Bellamy and what her life would look like now. The charges against her were serious. Fraud involving amounts over $10,000 was a felony in our state. She was looking at potential prison time, plus restitution for the money she'd taken from Darren. But more than that, her reputation was ruined. The story of the fake pregnancy announcement at Harold's funeral had already spread through our small community like wildfire. By now, everyone knew she'd been arrested for trying to defraud a widow and her grieving son. Marcus Reed, her partner in crime, had been arrested at his office that same afternoon. According to the news report we watched during dinner, police had found detailed plans for estate fraud schemes, including specific strategies for making posthumous paternity claims. They had it all mapped out, the reporter said. Bank accounts in multiple states, false identities prepared for quick relocations, even connections to corrupt medical professionals willing to provide fake pregnancy confirmations for the right price. Darren shook his head in disgust. She was a professional. This wasn't just about Harold's money. She was planning to do this to other families too. The thought made me sick. How many other widows might have fallen victim to Bellamy's schemes? How many other sons might have been manipulated the way Darren had been? But Harold had stopped her. Even in death, he'd protected not just our family, but potentially countless others. The phone rang during dinner, interrupting my thoughts. It was Mrs. Chen from the church, calling to check on us. "Oh, Bessie, dear," her voice was warm with sympathy. "I just heard about that terrible woman's arrest. I'm so sorry you had to go through all of this during your time of grief." "Thank you, Helen. We're managing." I have to admit, I always thought there was something off about her. The way she talked about Harold, claiming he was so excited about becoming a father again, it just didn't sound like the Harold I knew. After I hung up, more calls came. Friends, neighbors, people from the church, all expressing their support and their shock at Bellamy's deception. By 9 o'clock, I'd spoken to at least 15 people, all saying variations of the same thing. They'd suspected something wasn't right, but they'd never imagined the truth was so much worse. "People want to help," I told Darren as we finally turned off the phones. "Mrs. Rodriguez offered to bring dinner tomorrow. The Hendersons want to help you pack up Bellamy's things. Half the neighborhood has volunteered to do something. I don't know if I'm ready for all that attention." "You don't have to be ready, but when you are, they'll be there." As we prepared for bed, Darren was staying in the guest room until he figured out what to do about the house he'd shared with Bellamy. I realized something important. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt hopeful about the future. Not happy exactly. The grief was still too fresh for that, but hopeful. Bellamy had tried to destroy our family, to steal our legacy and poison our memories of Harold. Instead, she'd accomplished the exact opposite. She'd brought Darren and me closer together than we'd been in years. She'd reminded us of Harold's wisdom and love, and she'd shown us that we were stronger than we'd ever imagined. "Mom?" Darren's voice came from the doorway of his room. "Thank you for everything, for standing by me even when I was too stupid to see what was happening." "You weren't stupid," I repeated. "You were loving. Don't ever apologize for that. I won't make the same mistake again." "Good, but don't let her turn you cynical either. Harold wouldn't want that." Darren smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since the funeral. "No, he wouldn't. He always said the best way to honor good people was to keep being good yourself." He was right about that too. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about Harold's final gift to us, not just the money or the house, but the truth. He'd made sure that Bellamy's lies couldn't take root, couldn't poison our family from within. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Darren would have to divorce Bellamy, deal with lawyers and court proceedings, rebuild his life from scratch. I would have to learn how to be a widow, how to navigate the world without Harold's steady presence beside me. But we would face those challenges together, as a family, the way Harold had always intended. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our house, my house now, watching Darren teach his new girlfriend Sarah how to make Harold's famous Sunday pancakes. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, that for a moment I forgot about everything we'd been through. Bellamy had been sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution, not just the $1,500 she'd taken from Darren, but an additional $25,000 in damages and legal fees. Marcus Reed got 5 years and had his law license permanently revoked. The trial had been mercifully brief. With Harold's videos and the mountain of evidence he'd compiled, Bellamy's lawyer had advised her to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. She'd stood before the judge looking nothing like the polished manipulator who'd announced her fake pregnancy at Harold's funeral. Prison jumpsuit, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked ordinary, small, defeated. She'd tried to catch my eye during the sentencing, but I'd looked right through her. She'd forfeited any right to my attention or sympathy. "Darren tells me you're thinking about traveling," Sarah said, pulling me back to the present. She was a kindergarten teacher, divorced with 2 young children, and she treated my son with the kind of genuine affection that made my heart sing. "Harold always wanted to see Ireland," I said, flipping another pancake. "We kept saying we'd go next year, and then next year, and then—" I shrugged. "I figure it's time to stop saying next year." "That sounds wonderful. When are you thinking of going?" "September, after the kids are back in school and things settle down." Darren looked up from where he was showing Sarah the proper pancake flipping technique. "Are you sure you want to go alone, Mom?" "I won't be alone. Harold will be with me." It was true in a way. Harold's presence was everywhere in my life now, not in a sad, clinging to the past way, but in a peaceful, grateful way. I carried his memory like a warm blanket, comforting and protective. The insurance money had been substantial, enough to pay off the house completely, travel wherever I wanted, and still leave a significant inheritance for Darren. Harold had planned everything carefully, as always. "Besides," I added, "I'm not the same woman I was 6 months ago. I'm stronger now." And I was. Surviving Bellamy's manipulation, seeing Harold's plan unfold exactly as he'd intended, watching my son find his way back to happiness, all of it had changed me. I was 64 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly independent. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Sarah went to answer it, returning with Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez, both carrying covered dishes. "We brought lunch," Mrs. Chen announced, "and we want to hear about your Ireland plans." This had become our new Sunday tradition, friends and neighbors dropping by, sharing meals, catching up on each other's lives. The house that Bellamy had seen as a prize to be won had become what Harold and I had always intended it to be, a gathering place for the people we loved. As we sat around the dining room table, the same table where Harold and I had eaten our last breakfast together, where Bellamy had performed her grief after the funeral, I realized something profound. Bellamy's attempt to destroy our family had actually made us stronger. Not just Darren and me, but our entire community. People had been so horrified by her deception that they'd rallied around us in ways I'd never expected. The church had started a fund for elderly people who might be vulnerable to financial scams. Mrs. Henderson had organized a neighborhood watch program. The local police had even asked me to speak at a seminar about recognizing inheritance fraud. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Darren said as we cleared the dishes. "I think about how Dad knew exactly what she was planning, but he let her think she was getting away with it." "He was always good at chess," I said. "He could see 6 moves ahead." She really thought she'd won, didn't she? At the funeral, when she made that announcement, she thought she'd secured her future. She did, just not the future she was expecting. Sarah, who'd heard the whole story but had never met Bellamy, shook her head in amazement. "I can't imagine planning something so elaborate. The fake pregnancy, the boyfriend, all those lies. It must have taken months of preparation." "It did," I said. "But Harold was preparing too. That's the difference between them. She was planning to hurt people, and he was planning to protect them." Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and Darren and Sarah had left for dinner at her place, I sat in Harold's study. The room looked exactly the same as it had when he'd recorded those videos. His books still lined the shelves, his reading glasses still sat on the desk beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. I'd kept everything exactly as he'd left it, not out of inability to move on, but as a kind of shrine to the man who'd saved our family even after death. On the desk was a letter I'd been writing, not to Harold, but to the other victims of Bellamy and Marcus's scheme. The FBI had identified at least 4 other families who'd been targeted, though Bellamy's arrest had prevented most of the planned frauds from being completed. One woman, though, had lost over $50,000 to a similar inheritance scam before the arrests. She'd written to thank me for coming forward, for making sure Bellamy couldn't hurt anyone else. "Your husband's planning saved my family too," she'd written. "If you hadn't exposed her, she would have taken everything I had left." That letter was framed on Harold's desk now, a reminder that his final act of love had rippled out far beyond our own family. I opened the desk drawer and pulled out the small velvet box I kept there. Inside was Harold's wedding ring, the one the hospital had given me after he died, the one I hadn't been able to look at for weeks after the funeral. Now I held it up to the lamplight, watching it catch the golden glow. Harold had worn this ring for 38 years, through good times and bad, through Darren's teenage rebellion and my mother's long illness, through job losses and health scares and all the ordinary struggles that make up a marriage. He'd been wearing it the day he figured out Bellamy's plan. He'd been wearing it when he set up that camera to record his final messages. He'd been wearing it when he made sure that his family would be protected long after he was gone. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty room, "for everything." A soft breeze stirred the curtains at the open window, and I chose to believe it was Harold's way of saying, "You're welcome." The next morning, I called the travel agent and booked my trip to Ireland. 2 weeks in Dublin and the countryside, staying in small bed and breakfasts, visiting the places Harold had marked in his guidebooks. I also called the bank and set up a scholarship fund in Harold's name, money for young people who wanted to become teachers but couldn't afford college. It seemed like the kind of legacy he would have wanted. Darren came by that afternoon to help me start going through Harold's clothes, a task I'd been putting off for months. "You know what's funny?" he said as we folded shirts and sorted them into donation boxes. "I keep expecting to find evidence of what Bellamy claimed, love letters or something that would prove he really was having an affair with her." "There's nothing like that," I said confidently. "Harold loved me. He loved you. He would never have betrayed either of us. I know that now, but for a while, when she first made that announcement, I wondered." I stopped folding and looked at my son. "Do you want to know the real reason I smiled at the funeral, when she made that ridiculous announcement? Why? Because the night before Harold died, when he was in the hospital and we knew it was almost time, he told me about her plan. Not the details. He didn't want to burden me with those while I was grieving. But he told me she was going to try something desperate and that I shouldn't worry because he'd already taken care of it." Darren's eyes widened. "He told you?" He said, "Bessie, that woman is going to make a fool of herself at my funeral, but don't you worry. Just remember that I love you, and everything is going to be exactly as it should be." So when she stood up and claimed to be pregnant, I knew it was just the beginning of Harold's plan unfolding. I knew she was walking into a trap that had been months in the making. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, memories filling the space between us. When we were finished, we'd filled 6 boxes with clothes that would go to the church charity drive, and 1 small box of Harold's most treasured possessions that I would keep forever. At the bottom of Harold's dresser drawer, I found one last surprise, a letter addressed to me in his familiar handwriting. "To my dearest Bessie," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've survived everything Bellamy threw at you, and I'm proud of you for staying strong." The letter went on for 3 pages, full of Harold's plans for my future, his hopes for Darren, and his absolute confidence that our family's love would triumph over Bellamy's greed. "Don't spend too much time grieving for me," the letter concluded. "Live the life we planned together. Just live it for both of us now. Take that trip to Ireland. Learn to paint like you always wanted to. Spoil whatever grandchildren Darren gives you. And remember that love always wins in the end, even when it takes a while for the victory to become clear." That night, I called Darren to read him parts of the letter. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "He really did think of everything, didn't he?" he finally said. "Everything that mattered. I love you, Mom, and I'm glad we made it through this together." "So am I, honey. So am I." 6 months later, I was sitting in a pub in Galway, Ireland, raising a pint of Guinness to Harold's memory and watching the sunset paint the harbor golden. I'd made friends with other travelers, learned to navigate train schedules, discovered that I could be perfectly happy eating alone in restaurants. The grief was still there. It probably always would be. But it had transformed into something gentler, something that could coexist with joy and adventure and hope for the future. Bellamy Parker had tried to steal my family's legacy, but she'd failed completely. Harold's love had protected us, guided us, and ultimately set us free to build the life he'd always wanted us to have. And somewhere in that Irish sunset, I could feel him smiling. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.